The night Gideon Cole wrapped his last blanket around the shoulders of a dying woman was the night his entire world shifted on its axis. Though he would not understand this until much later when her dark eyes met his across a campfire, and he felt something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for far too long. The wind howled across the plains of Wyoming Territory like a living thing with teeth, cutting through Gideon's worn coat as he guided his horse along the narrow trail leading away from White River. It was February of 1878, and the winter had been brutal, claiming lives from homesteaders and travelers alike. Gideon had been riding for 3 days straight, delivering a message from the railroad company to a camp of surveyors camped near the Montana border, and his supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. He had enough jerky to last another day, maybe 2 if he rationed carefully, and his canteen was half full. Most importantly, he had 1 blanket rolled up behind his saddle, the thick wool one his mother had woven before the fever took her 5 years back. He was thinking about stopping to make camp when he saw the figure collapsed beside a dead juniper tree. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the fading light, but as he drew closer, he could make out the shape of a person curled into themselves, barely moving. Gideon pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, his boots crunching in the frozen snow. The figure was a woman, her long black hair tangled with ice crystals, her lips blue with cold. She wore doeskin clothing that might have been warm enough in autumn, but offered little protection against this killing freeze. Her eyes flickered open as he approached, and even in the dim light, Gideon could see they were the color of rich earth after rain. She tried to speak, but her teeth chattered too violently. Without thinking, without considering what it would cost him, Gideon untied the blanket from his saddle and wrapped it around her shaking form. She was barely conscious, and he knew if he left her here, she would be dead by morning. "Can you stand?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. She managed a small shake of her head. Gideon looked around at the empty landscape, at the sky darkening toward full night, and made his decision. He lifted her carefully onto his horse, then swung up behind her, holding her steady against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, and that worried him. How long had she been out here without food or shelter? He found a small depression in the rocks about a mile south, just enough to block the worst of the wind. Building a fire took longer than usual with his fingers numb from cold, but eventually he got one going. The woman had not said a word, just huddled in his blanket, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he could not fathom. When he offered her some of his jerky and water, she took it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice rough but clear. Her English was good, with only a slight accent. "You are kind to help me." "Could not leave you to freeze," Gideon replied, settling on the opposite side of the fire. The cold was already seeping into his bones without the blanket, but he kept his expression neutral. He had survived worse. "My name is Chenoa," she said. "Of the Shoshone people." "Gideon Cole," he replied. "Just a working man trying to get back home." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Gideon noticed she was studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she was seeing past his weather-beaten exterior to something deeper inside. "You gave me your only blanket," Chenoa said at last. "It was not a question. You needed it more than I did." "You will freeze tonight." "I will manage." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, and he thought that was the end of the conversation. But then she said something that surprised him. "Why are you alone out here in the dead of winter?" "Could ask you the same thing." A shadow passed over her face. "My husband died 2 moons ago. Sickness took him and 7 others from our band. I was traveling to stay with my mother's sister when my horse stepped in a hole and broke its leg. I had to walk, but the storm came suddenly." She paused. "I thought I would join my husband in the spirit world." "I am sorry for your loss," Gideon said, and meant it. He knew what grief looked like, had carried it himself since losing his own family to various tragedies over the years. "And you?" Chenoa asked. "Why do you travel alone?" Gideon poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. "Never found much reason to stay in one place too long. My parents died, my brother went east to make his fortune, and I just kept moving. The railroad pays decent for couriers, and I am good at finding my way through rough country. That is a lonely life. It suits me well enough." But even as he said it, Gideon felt the hollowness of the words. He was 32 years old and had nothing to show for it but a good horse, a decent rifle, and the clothes on his back. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he wondered what it might be like to have a home again, to have someone waiting for him. But those thoughts never lasted long. In his experience, caring about things only meant more pain when they were inevitably taken away. The night grew colder. Gideon fed the fire constantly, trying to keep enough heat going to compensate for his lack of blanket. He dozed fitfully, waking every time a shiver racked his body. Across the fire, Chenoa slept deeply, exhausted from her ordeal. When dawn finally broke, gray and cheerless, Gideon was relieved just to have survived. Chenoa woke slowly, and when she saw him, her eyes widened with concern. "You look terrible." "Feel about how I look," Gideon admitted. His whole body ached with cold, and his fingers were stiff and clumsy. "But I will warm up once we get moving." "You need this more than I do now," Chenoa said, starting to unwrap the blanket. "No," Gideon said firmly. "You are still recovering. I will be fine once I get some blood moving." They shared the last of his jerky for breakfast, and Gideon helped her onto his horse again. His plan was to bring her to White River, where she could rest and recover before continuing her journey. The town had a small boarding house run by a decent woman who would not turn away someone in need, regardless of their heritage. It was a hard 2-day ride back, but Gideon figured they could make it if the weather held. It did not hold. By midday, fresh snow began falling, thick and fast, cutting visibility to almost nothing. Gideon kept going, trusting his instincts and his horse's sense of direction, but he knew they were in trouble. As darkness fell again, they found shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin, half collapsed, but still offering more protection than the open plains. Inside, it was barely warmer than outside, but at least they were out of the wind. Gideon got another fire going in the old stone hearth, and they huddled close to it. His entire body shook with cold now, and he could not seem to stop it. "You will die if you do not share this blanket," Chenoa said quietly. "I will not allow you to freeze because of your kindness to me." "It would not be proper," Gideon protested weakly. "Proper?" Chenoa's eyes flashed. "You saved my life. If you die now, your sacrifice means nothing. Come here." She opened the blanket in invitation, and after a moment's hesitation, Gideon moved to sit beside her. She wrapped the blanket around them both, and the shared warmth was immediately better. They sat pressed together, and Gideon became acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of sage that clung to her hair, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Thank you," he murmured. "You are a good man, Gideon Cole," she said. "There are not many who would have stopped to help me. There are not many who would share their only blanket with a stranger either," he replied. They talked through the night, sharing stories to pass the long hours. Chenoa told him about growing up with her people, about learning to track game from her father and healing herbs from her grandmother. She spoke of her husband with warmth but not overwhelming grief, explaining that he had been chosen for her when she was young, and while they had cared for each other, it had not been a love match in the way of the old stories. Gideon found himself telling her things he had not shared with anyone in years. About his childhood on a small farm in Missouri, about the day soldiers came and burned everything during the border wars, about watching his father die trying to defend their land, about his mother wasting away from heartbreak and hardship, about his younger brother Thomas, who had been only 15 when he left for Philadelphia, promising to write but never doing so. "You carry much sorrow," Chenoa observed. "It has made you believe you must always be alone." "Maybe," Gideon admitted, "or maybe I have just learned that nothing good lasts." "But that is not true," Chenoa said. "Good things last if you are willing to fight for them, if you are willing to take the risk of loss for the chance of something real." Her words settled into him, finding cracks in the walls he had built around his heart. He looked at her face in the firelight, seeing not just her beauty but her strength, her wisdom. This was a woman who had suffered and survived, who had walked through the valley of death and emerged still believing in hope. Something in his chest tightened, an unfamiliar feeling that was both terrifying and exhilarating. By morning the storm had passed, leaving a world transformed by fresh snow. They continued toward White River, and this time Chenoa rode behind Gideon, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The contact felt natural, comfortable in a way that surprised him. They stopped frequently to rest the horse, and during these breaks they continued their conversations, learning more about each other with every passing hour. When White River finally came into view on the second day, Gideon felt an unexpected reluctance. Once they reached town, Chenoa would recover and continue her journey, and he would likely never see her again. The thought created a hollow feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, who ran the boarding house, took one look at Chenoa and immediately ushered her inside, clucking about the state of her and demanding to know what fool had let a woman nearly freeze to death. Gideon explained the situation, carefully leaving out the part where he had given up his only blanket. Mrs. Brennan was a good woman but fiercely practical, and she would have given him an earful about risking his own life. "She can stay here until she is ready to travel," Mrs. Brennan declared. "And you, Gideon Cole, look like you could use a hot meal and a warm bed yourself." Gideon wanted to refuse, but he was exhausted and half frozen, and the offer was too tempting. He agreed to stay one night just to recover his strength. Mrs. Brennan gave him a room down the hall from Chenoa, and after a bath and a proper meal, he fell into bed and slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke, it was late afternoon of the following day. He dressed and went downstairs, where he found Chenoa sitting in Mrs. Brennan's parlor, looking much recovered. She wore a borrowed dress of simple gray cotton, and her long hair had been washed and braided. She looked up when he entered, and her smile was like sunrise. "You look better," she said. "So do you," he replied, taking a seat across from her. "I am glad to see you recovered." "Thanks to you." She paused, and her expression grew serious. "I have been thinking about what to do next. My mother's sister lives 3 days' ride north of here, but the winter is still dangerous for traveling. Mrs. Brennan has offered to let me stay and work from my room and board until spring, and I have decided to accept." Gideon tried to hide his relief. "That sounds like a wise choice. And what will you do?" "I need to report back to the railroad office, let them know the message was delivered. Then I suppose I will look for the next job." "Will you be staying in White River?" He had not planned to. White River was just another stop on his endless wandering, but looking at Chenoa now, at the hope in her eyes, he found himself reconsidering. "Might stay a while," he said carefully. "Winter is hard for traveling, like you said." Her smile widened. "I would like that." Over the following weeks, Gideon found reasons to linger in White River. There was work available at the lumber mill, hard physical labor that paid enough for him to rent a small room above the general store. He told himself it was practical, that winter was indeed too harsh for traveling, but deep down he knew the truth. He was staying because of Chenoa. They saw each other often. Mrs. Brennan's boarding house served as a gathering place for the more progressive members of White River's small community, and Gideon started taking his evening meals there. He and Chenoa would sit together, talking long after the other diners had left. They went for walks when the weather permitted, and Gideon showed her around the town, introducing her to the people he knew. Not everyone in White River was welcoming. Some of the townsfolk looked at Chenoa with suspicion or outright hostility, still carrying the prejudices and fears that had fueled conflicts for decades. But Chenoa handled it with grace and dignity, never responding to provocations, always maintaining her calm demeanor. Gideon found himself growing angry on her behalf, wanting to defend her against every slight glance and whispered comment. "It does not matter," Chenoa told him one evening when he had confronted a drunk miner who had said something crude. "Their opinions do not change who I am." "But it is not right," Gideon insisted. "You deserve respect, and I have yours," she said gently. "That is enough." But was it? Gideon lay awake that night, thinking about the world they lived in, about the injustices he had witnessed and ignored in his years of wandering. He had always told himself it was not his fight, that he was just trying to survive in a hard world. But knowing Chenoa was changing that. She made him want to be better, to stand for something more than his own survival. As the weeks turned into months, Gideon realized he was falling in love with her. It crept up on him gradually, revealed in small moments. The way she laughed at his stories, the concentration on her face as she sewed torn clothing for Mrs. Brennan, the patience with which she taught him a few words of her language, the wisdom she shared when he talked about his past regrets. Every moment with her felt like discovering something precious he had not known he was missing, but he was afraid to say anything. What could he offer her? He was a drifter with no real prospects, no land, no family. She had already been married once, to someone chosen by her community. Why would she want someone like him? March came with its false promises of spring, bright days that still ended in freezing nights. Gideon was walking back from the mill one evening when he saw a commotion outside the general store. A small crowd had gathered, and he could hear angry voices. He pushed through to find Chenoa standing very still while a red-faced man in expensive clothes shouted at her. "I do not care what Mrs. Brennan says. Your kind is not welcome in my establishment," the man was saying. This was Harold Fletcher, who owned the store and several other businesses in town. "I've told you before, I do not serve Indians." "I only wanted to purchase thread," Chenoa said quietly. "I have money to pay." "I do not want your money. Get out." Gideon felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate. He stepped forward, placing himself between Chenoa and Fletcher. "She is a paying customer, same as anyone else." "This is not your concern, Cole," Fletcher said, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. Gideon had a reputation as a hard man, someone you did not want to cross. "It is my concern when I see someone being treated poorly for no good reason," Gideon replied. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "She has done nothing wrong. She just wants to buy thread." "I have the right to refuse service to anyone," Fletcher blustered. "And I have the right to tell everyone in this town what kind of man you are," Gideon said. "Might be folks would be interested to know you care more about a person's heritage than their character or their money." Fletcher's face grew even redder. The crowd was watching now, murmuring among themselves. Some looked approving, others uncomfortable. In a small town like White River, reputation mattered, and Fletcher knew it. After a long moment, he stepped back. "Fine," he spat. "Buy your thread and get out." Chenoa completed her purchase with quiet dignity, and Gideon walked her back to the boarding house. Once they were alone, she turned to him. "You did not have to do that," she said. "You might have made an enemy." "I could not stand by and watch him treat you that way," Gideon replied. "You were right before when you said their opinions do not matter, but that does not mean I will let them act on their prejudices without challenge." Chenoa reached out and took his hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact since those nights sharing his blanket. "You are a good man, Gideon Cole," she said softly. "Better than you believe yourself to be. I am just trying to do what is right. It is more than that." She stepped closer, looking up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul. "You have a good heart. You try to hide it, try to pretend you are just a drifter who cares for nothing, but I see you. I see who you really are." Gideon's throat felt tight. "And who is that?" "Someone who deserves to be happy. Someone who deserves love." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Gideon wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her everything he had been feeling, but fear held him back. "Chenoa, I have something to ask you," she interrupted. "Will you come with me tomorrow?" "There is somewhere I want to take you," he agreed, curious and nervous. The next day was Sunday, and they left early, before most of the town was awake. Chenoa borrowed a horse from Mrs. Brennan, and they rode north, following a trail that wound through pine forest still heavy with snow. After several hours, they reached a small valley where a group of lodges stood beside a frozen stream. "This is where some of my people are wintering," Chenoa explained. "I sent word to my aunt that I was staying in White River, but I wanted to visit, to let her know I am well. And I wanted her to meet you." Gideon felt a flutter of anxiety. "Are you sure that is wise? I am not sure I will be welcome." "You will be welcome because I am bringing you," Chenoa said firmly. "My aunt is a respected woman. Her opinion matters." They were greeted cautiously at first, but Chenoa's presence eased the tension. An older woman emerged from one of the lodges, her face lighting up when she saw her niece. They embraced, speaking rapidly in their language, and then Chenoa turned to introduce Gideon. "Aunt, this is Gideon Cole. He saved my life when I was freezing on the trail. He gave me his only blanket even though it meant he might die." The older woman, whose name was Kamama, studied Gideon with intense, intelligent eyes. Then she spoke in English. "You did this thing." "I could not leave her to die," Gideon replied simply. Kamama continued to stare at him, and Gideon had the uncomfortable feeling of being weighed and measured. Finally, she nodded. "Come, we will eat and you will tell me your story." They spent the day in the camp, and Gideon found himself welcomed with cautious hospitality. Kamama was indeed a woman of influence, and her acceptance of him seemed to open doors. He met Chenoa's cousins and friends, shared food around the fire, and tried his best to be respectful of customs he did not fully understand. At one point, Chenoa and Kamama went aside to speak privately, leaving Gideon with a young man named Takoda who spoke good English. They talked about hunting and horses, safe topics, but Gideon could feel the young man assessing him. "Chenoa speaks highly of you," Takoda said eventually. "She says you are an honorable man. I try to be." "Our people have not had good experiences with white men," Takoda said bluntly. "We have been pushed from our lands, lied to, killed. It is hard to trust." "I understand," Gideon said. "I cannot speak for what others have done. I can only tell you who I am and what I believe. I believe every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I believe the injustices committed against your people are wrong, and I believe Chenoa is one of the finest people I have ever met." Takoda regarded him thoughtfully. "She has been sad since her husband died, but lately when she speaks of you, there is light in her eyes again." "Do not be the one to put out that light." "I would never want to hurt her," Gideon said seriously. Wanting and doing are different things, but I think you mean it." Takoda paused. She will need someone strong beside her. The path she is choosing, living between two worlds, it will not be easy. When Chenoa returned, she was smiling. "My aunt has given her blessing," she said quietly to Gideon. "Blessing for what? Come, let us ride back and I will explain." They left the camp with promises to visit again soon, and as they rode through the lengthening shadows, Chenoa finally spoke. "I told my aunt about you, about how you saved me, about how you have treated me since, about how I feel when I am with you." Gideon's heart began to pound. "And how is that?" "Safe," Chenoa said. "Seen. Valued." "I told her that I think I am falling in love with you, and I wanted to know if I was being foolish, if I was betraying my husband's memory or my people by caring for a white man." "What did she say?" Gideon asked, barely breathing. "She said that love is a gift, and it should never be refused out of fear or pride. She said that you proved your character when you gave me your blanket, and that actions speak louder than heritage. She said that if you make me happy, if you treat me with respect and kindness, then I should not let anything stop me from reaching for that happiness." They had reached a clearing, and Chenoa pulled her horse to a stop. Gideon did the same, turning to face her. The setting sun painted the snow gold and pink, and her face was radiant in the light. "Gideon Cole," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I am not a woman who plays games or hides her feelings. I am done with that, so I am going to tell you plainly what I want." She took a deep breath. "I want you. I want a life with you. I want to build something real and lasting despite all the difficulties we will face. I know it will not be easy. I know there will be people who disapprove, who will make things hard for us. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and true, and I will not let fear stop me from saying it." Gideon sat frozen in his saddle, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Chenoa, I am nobody. I have nothing to offer you, no land, no prospects, just yourself," she interrupted. "And that is everything I want. I am not asking you to be rich or powerful. I am asking you to be my partner, my friend, my love. I am asking you to build a life with me, whatever that looks like. If you feel the same way, if you want that too, then say so. But if you do not, if I have misjudged, then tell me now so we can both move forward." For a long moment, Gideon could not speak. His throat was too tight, his eyes burning with unexpected tears. He thought about all the years he had spent running, convincing himself he was better off alone. He thought about the walls he had built around his heart, and how this woman had somehow walked right through them without even trying. He thought about the future, about the possibility of having someone to come home to, someone to build a life with, someone to love. "I feel the same way," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been falling in love with you since the night you told me I deserved to be happy, maybe even before that. I have been afraid to say anything because I thought I had nothing worthy to offer, but if you truly want me, then I am yours. I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Chenoa's smile was brilliant, transforming her whole face. She dismounted and walked to his horse, and Gideon quickly swung down to meet her. They stood facing each other, and then she reached up to cup his face with her hands. "You already are worthy," she said. "You just have to believe it." And then she kissed him, and it was like nothing Gideon had ever experienced. It was gentle and fierce all at once, full of promise and hope. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was what he had been missing all these years. This connection, this rightness, this sense of finally being home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Chenoa laughed. "I should have done that weeks ago." "I am glad you did it now," Gideon said, touching his forehead to hers. "I love you, Chenoa. I love your strength and your wisdom and your kindness. I love the way you see the world. I love who I am when I am with you." "I love you too," she said. "And now we must figure out how to build a life together." They rowed back to White River as the stars came out, making plans and dreaming aloud. It would not be simple, they both knew that, but they were committed to making it work. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Brennan took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "About time you two figured it out," she said. "I have been watching you dance around each other for months." Over the following weeks, Gideon and Chenoa began building their life together. Gideon proposed properly, with a ring he bought from a traveling jeweler, and Chenoa accepted with tears of joy. They decided to marry in a simple ceremony that would honor both their traditions, with Mrs. Brennan and Kamama standing as witnesses. Not everyone in White River approved. Harold Fletcher made his displeasure known, and there were others who muttered about mixed marriages and keeping to your own kind. But there were also allies. Mrs. Brennan was vocally supportive, as was the town's doctor, a man named Samuel Reed who had traveled widely and held progressive views. The local minister, Reverend Thomas Caldwell, agreed to perform the ceremony after speaking with both Gideon and Chenoa, and being impressed by the depth of their commitment. The wedding took place in early May of 1878, on a hillside overlooking White River. Kamama came with several members of Chenoa's family, and they incorporated elements of Shoshone tradition into the ceremony. It was not large or grand, but it was perfect. When Gideon looked into Chenoa's eyes and spoke his vows, he meant every word with his entire being. He promised to love her, to stand beside her, to face whatever challenges came their way together. Chenoa's vows were equally moving. She spoke about finding light in darkness, about the gift of second chances, about building a future based on respect and partnership. When they were finally pronounced husband and wife, Gideon kissed her to cheers and applause from their small gathering of supporters. They had rented a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but solid and warm. Mrs. Brennan had helped Chenoa furnish it with donated furniture and homemade quilts. Their first night as husband and wife was spent in their own home, in their own bed, and it felt like a miracle. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies, whispering promises and endearments in the darkness. Afterward, lying tangled together, Chenoa traced patterns on Gideon's chest. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied honestly. "I never thought I would have this. A home, a wife, a future. You have given me everything." "We have given each other everything," she corrected. "That is what partnership means." Life settled into a rhythm. Gideon continued working at the lumber mill, and Chenoa took in sewing and helped Mrs. Brennan at the boarding house. They saved money carefully, dreaming of buying land someday, of having a place truly their own. In the evenings, they would sit on their small porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, and talk about their hopes for the future. The prejudice they faced did not disappear, but they learned to navigate it. Some shopkeepers remained hostile, but others came around, won over by Chenoa's quiet dignity and Gideon's steady work ethic. They made friends among the more open-minded residents, and Chenoa stayed connected to her family, visiting the camp regularly and bringing Gideon with her. In the winter of their first year of marriage, Chenoa told Gideon she was pregnant. The news filled him with a complex mix of joy and terror. He had never been a father before, had never expected to be one. What if he failed? What if he could not provide for a child? But Chenoa's confidence helped steady him. "We will figure it out together," she said, "like we figure out everything else." Their son was born in August of 1879, a warm summer evening when the light lasted long into the night. The birth was attended by Kamama and Mrs. Brennan, who had become unlikely friends over the past year. Gideon paced anxiously outside until he heard the baby's first cry, and then he was ushered in to meet his son. The baby was perfect, with a thick shock of dark hair in his mother's eyes. Gideon held him carefully, almost afraid he might break, and felt tears streaming down his face. This tiny person was his son, and the love he felt was overwhelming. "What should we name him?" Chenoa asked, exhausted but glowing. They had discussed names before, wanting something that honored both their heritages. After much consideration, they chose Samuel after Dr. Reed, who had been so supportive, with a middle name of Takoda, after Chenoa's cousin who had become a good friend to them both. Samuel Takoda Cole was a healthy, happy baby who quickly became the center of their world. Gideon discovered he loved fatherhood, despite his initial fears. He would spend hours just watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes, the perfect ears, the way Samuel's face would scrunch up before he cried. He sang to him, told him stories, carried him around the house while Chenoa rested. Life was not always easy. Money was often tight, and they had to be careful with every penny. There were still people in town who looked at their mixed family with disapproval or hostility. But there was also so much joy. Watching Samuel grow, seeing his first smile, hearing his first laugh. The quiet evenings at home, the three of them together. The visits from Kamama and Chenoa's family, who adored their newest member. The support of their friends in White River. By the time Samuel was 2 years old, Gideon and Chenoa had saved enough money to make a down payment on a piece of land just outside town. It was not much, just 20 acres with a small creek running through it, but it was theirs. They worked together to build a proper house, with help from friends and family. Gideon did the heavy construction while Chenoa supervised and handled the detailed work. It took most of a year, but by the winter of 1881, they were able to move into their own house on their own land. Standing on the porch of their new home, looking out over their property with Samuel playing at their feet, Gideon felt a contentment he had never imagined possible. "We did it," he said to Chenoa. "We built something real." "We did," she agreed, slipping her hand into his. "And this is just the beginning." She was right. Over the next few years, they continued to build their life and their homestead. They planted a garden and added chickens and a milk cow. Gideon began taking carpentry jobs in addition to his mill work, discovering he had a talent for building furniture. Chenoa's sewing business grew as her reputation for quality work spread. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. In 1883, Chenoa gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Caroline Me, though they called her Caro. She had Gideon's fair coloring and Chenoa's dark eyes, and she was spirited from the moment she arrived, keeping them all on their toes. Samuel adored his little sister, and watching them play together filled Gideon's heart to bursting. The prejudice they faced became less pronounced over time, though it never entirely disappeared. White River was changing, growing, and becoming more diverse. Other mixed families moved to the area, and there was strength in numbers. Gideon and Chenoa became known as upstanding members of the community, and their children were accepted at the local school that had been established. Still, there were difficult moments. When Samuel was 7, he came home crying because another boy had called him names and said he did not belong. Gideon held his son and struggled to find the right words. "Some people are afraid of anything different," he finally said. "They have been taught to hate, and they do not know better. But that is their failing, not yours. You are perfect exactly as you are." "But why do they hate me?" Samuel asked. "I have not done anything to them." "Because they are small-minded and scared," Chenoa said, joining them. "But Samuel, listen to me. You come from two strong peoples." You have the best of both worlds inside you. Never let anyone make you feel less than you are." It was a conversation they would have to have multiple times over the years with both children, teaching them to be proud of who they were while also being realistic about the challenges they would face. It was not easy, but Gideon and Chenoa were determined to raise children who were confident and compassionate. As the years passed, Gideon sometimes thought back to that freezing night when he had given his last blanket to a dying woman on the trail. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, a simple act of human decency. He never could have imagined it would change his entire life, but it had. That one moment of compassion had led him to Chenoa, had given him a family, had shown him what it meant to truly live rather than just exist. In 1889, when Chenoa told him she was pregnant again, they were both surprised. At 43 and 35, they had thought their family was complete, but the news brought joy nonetheless. Their third child, a son they named David Hinto, was born that December, an early Christmas present. The older children doted on him, and Gideon found himself once again marveling at the miracle of new life. By 1892, their homestead had grown to include a barn, a proper workshop for Gideon's carpentry business, and additional land they had purchased as their finances improved. Samuel, now 13, was tall and serious, with his mother's quiet strength. Caro, at 9, was a whirlwind of energy and opinions, always asking questions and challenging assumptions. And little David, at 2, was just beginning to form his own personality, showing signs of both his siblings' traits. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Samuel asked about how his parents had met. It was a story they had told before, but the children never tired of hearing it. "Your father saved my life," Chenoa said, smiling at Gideon across the table. "I was freezing and alone, and he gave me his only blanket." "Even though he might have died?" Caro asked, eyes wide. "Even though," Gideon confirmed. "I could not just leave her there." "That is because Papa is a hero," Samuel said. "I am no hero," Gideon protested. "I just did what any decent person would do." "But you are," Chenoa said softly. "You are my hero. You saved my life, and then you gave me a reason to live it. You gave me love and a family and a home. That makes you a hero." Gideon felt his eyes sting with tears, something that still happened even after all these years together. "You gave me those same things," he said. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions. You taught me how to truly live." "What happened next?" David asked, too young to fully understand but caught up in the story anyway. "Well," Chenoa said, "I got better, and then I realized I had fallen in love with this stubborn cowboy who did not think he deserved good things, so I had to convince him otherwise." "How did you do that?" Caro asked. "I told him the truth," Chenoa said simply. "That he was worthy of love, that he was a good man, and that I wanted to build a life with him. And luckily, he believed me." "Best decision I ever made," Gideon added, reaching across the table to take her hand. As the children grew older, they each carved out their own paths. Samuel showed an interest in medicine and began apprenticing with Dr. Reed, now quite elderly but still practicing. Caro declared she wanted to be a teacher and threw herself into her studies with determination. David was still young, but he showed a love of animals and spent hours helping with the livestock. In 1897, when Samuel was 18 and preparing to leave for medical school in Denver, Gideon had a long talk with his son. They sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over their land, and Gideon felt the weight of time passing. "I am proud of you," Gideon said. "Prouder than I can ever express. You have become a fine man." "I learned from you," Samuel replied. "You and Mama taught me what it means to be good, to stand up for what is right, to love without reservation." "The world you are going into is not always kind," Gideon said carefully. "You will face challenges because of who you are, because of your mixed heritage. But never forget that your heritage is your strength. You carry the best of both worlds inside you." "I know," Samuel said. "And I know that whatever happens, I have you and Mama supporting me. That makes all the difference." When Samuel left for Denver that fall, there were tears from everyone, but also pride and hope. He would come home for visits, and he wrote long letters about his studies and his experiences. Despite facing discrimination, he persevered, driven by his desire to help people and make his parents proud. As the new century approached, Gideon and Chenoa found themselves in their 50s, their children grown or nearly so. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs. Their love had not only endured but had deepened with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary in May of 1898, Gideon took Chenoa back to the hillside where they had been married. It was a beautiful spring day with wildflowers blooming and birds singing. They stood looking out over the valley, hands clasped. "You ever regret it?" Gideon asked. "Choosing me, choosing this life. You could have had an easier path." Chenoa turned to look at him, her dark eyes as deep and compelling as they had been that first night. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for one single moment. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You stood beside me through everything. You are my heart, Gideon Cole. You always will be." "You are mine," he replied. "That night when I gave you my blanket, I thought I was just helping someone in need. I never imagined I was meeting the person who would change my entire life." "It was meant to be," Chenoa said. "The spirits brought us together, and I thank them every day for that gift." They kissed there on the hillside, and Gideon felt the same spark he had felt on their wedding night, the same deep connection that had only grown stronger over 2 decades together. This was what love was supposed to be. Not just passion and romance, though there was plenty of that, but also partnership and friendship and unwavering support. It was building something together, facing challenges side by side, celebrating victories and weathering defeats as a team. In 1900, Samuel returned to White River with his medical degree and opened a practice in town. He was the first doctor of Native American heritage in the region, and he faced some resistance initially, but his skill and compassion won people over. He also brought home a young woman named Rebecca, whom he had met during his studies. She was the daughter of a prominent Denver family, but she loved Samuel for who he was, not despite it. Their wedding was a joyous occasion that brought both families together. Caro followed her dreams and became a teacher, opening a small school on the homestead where she taught children from town and from the nearby Shoshone camps. She believed strongly in education as a path to opportunity, and she worked tirelessly to give her students the tools they would need to succeed. She never married, declaring that her students were her family, though Gideon suspected there was a ranch hand named Joseph who had caught her eye. David, at 11, was still finding his way, but he showed a natural gift with animals and talked about becoming a veterinarian someday. He was a sweet-natured boy, sensitive and thoughtful, and both Gideon and Chenoa delighted in his presence. As Gideon approached his 60th birthday in 1905, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that cold night in February of 1878. He had gone from a lonely drifter with no purpose to a man with a wife he adored, 3 successful children, a thriving homestead, and a community he was proud to be part of. He had found meaning and purpose, had built something lasting. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would take out his mother's blanket, the one he had given to Chenoa that first night. She had kept it all these years, carefully preserved, and she had sewn new binding on the edges when they began to fray. It was a symbol of everything they had built together, of the selfless act that had sparked a lifetime of love. One winter evening, as they sat by the fire with David reading nearby, Chenoa resting her head on Gideon's shoulder, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. "What are you thinking?" Chenoa asked, always attuned to his moods. "Just how lucky I am," he replied. "How one decision, one moment of compassion led to all of this. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had ridden past you that night." "But you did not," Chenoa said. "Because that is who you are. You are the man who stops to help, who gives his last blanket to a stranger, who stands up for what is right even when it is hard. That is why I love you." "And I love you," Gideon said, kissing the top of her head, "more than words can express." In 1908, Samuel and Rebecca welcomed their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth, making Gideon and Chenoa grandparents. Holding that tiny baby, Gideon felt the circle of life continuing, felt the legacy they were building. Elizabeth would grow up knowing both sides of her heritage, would be raised with love and acceptance, would have opportunities her grandparents could only have dreamed of. Caro finally admitted her feelings for Joseph, and they were married in a simple ceremony in 1909. She continued teaching, and Joseph helped expand the homestead, adding more land and livestock. They talked about having children someday, and Gideon and Chenoa looked forward to more grandchildren. David, at 20, was preparing to leave for veterinary school, following in Samuel's footsteps of pursuing higher education. He was nervous but excited, and Gideon gave him the same advice he had given Samuel years before. "Remember who you are and where you come from. Let that be your strength." As the years continued to pass, Gideon and Chenoa settled into a comfortable rhythm. They were not as spry as they once were, but they were healthy and active. They spent their days working on the homestead, entertaining grandchildren, and enjoying each other's company. After more than 30 years of marriage, they still found new things to talk about, still laughed together, still looked forward to each day. In the summer of 1915, White River held a celebration for its 50th anniversary. As one of the older families in town, Gideon and Chenoa were honored guests. Standing before the gathered crowd, Gideon was asked to speak about the early days. "When I first came to White River," he said, "I was a different man. I was alone, bitter, convinced that caring about anything was a recipe for heartbreak. But then I met someone who showed me a different way. My wife Chenoa taught me that love is worth the risk, that building something with another person is the most meaningful thing we can do. Our life together has not always been easy. We have faced prejudice and hardship, struggled with finances and illness, dealt with all the normal challenges of raising a family. But we have faced it together, and that has made all the difference." Chenoa squeezed his hand and he looked down at her, seeing the same beautiful woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Yes, there were lines on her face now, and silver streaks in her dark hair, but she was still the strongest, wisest, most compassionate person he had ever known. "What I want to say to everyone here," Gideon continued, "is that kindness matters. Compassion matters. One act of decency can change a life, can ripple out in ways you never imagine. When I gave my blanket to a freezing woman on the trail 37 years ago, I had no idea it would lead to this. To a marriage that has been my greatest joy. To children and grandchildren who make me proud every day. To a life that has meaning and purpose. So do not underestimate the power of simple goodness. You never know what it might bring." The crowd applauded, and people came up afterward to share their own stories of kindness and connection. It was a beautiful day, full of community and celebration, and Gideon felt blessed to be part of it. In 1920, as Gideon turned 74 and Chenoa 66, they decided to write down their story for their grandchildren. Sitting together in the evenings, they collaborated on a long letter that detailed their meeting, their courtship, and the life they had built together. They wanted future generations to know the truth of their love, to understand the challenges they had overcome, and the joy they had found. "I want them to know that love transcends boundaries," Chenoa said as they worked on the letter. "That when two people commit to each other fully, they can overcome anything. I want them to know that it is never too late to change your life," Gideon added. "I was 32 when I met you, convinced my life was settled, but you showed me I was wrong. You showed me I could have more, could be more." By this time, they had 4 grandchildren with more on the way. Samuel and Rebecca had 3 children now, all bright and curious. Caro and Joseph had finally welcomed their first baby, a son, and were overjoyed. David had married a wonderful woman named Martha, and they were expecting their first child. The family gatherings were loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect. In their golden years, Gideon and Chenoa spent much of their time on the porch of their home, watching the world go by. The homestead was now run primarily by Caro and Joseph, with help from the grandchildren when they visited. Gideon still did some light carpentry work, more as a hobby than a necessity, and Chenoa still sewed, creating beautiful quilts for each new grandchild. They talked often about the past, remembering favorite moments and laughing over old stories. But they also stayed present, engaging with their family, keeping up with world events and continuing to learn and grow. Their minds remained sharp, and their love remained strong. In the spring of 1924, they celebrated their 46th wedding anniversary. The whole family gathered for a party, and as Gideon looked around at the crowd of children and grandchildren, all there because of the love he and Chenoa shared, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone home and they were alone again, Chenoa took his hand. "It has been a good life," she said softly. "The best life," Gideon agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you remember what I told you that day in the clearing?" Chenoa asked. "When I asked you to be with me." "Every word," Gideon said. "You told me you wanted to build something real and lasting despite the difficulties. You said what you felt was true and you would not let fear stop you." "And I was right," Chenoa said with satisfaction. "We built something beautiful. Something that will last long after we are gone." "Our children," Gideon said. "Our grandchildren, the example we set. Yes, it will last." They sat together as darkness fell, comfortable in the silence, needing no words to communicate the depth of their feeling. After 46 years, they knew each other's hearts as well as their own. The years continued to roll by, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Gideon and Chenoa's health remained relatively good, though they moved more slowly and tired more easily. They stayed active and engaged as long as they could, refusing to let age diminish them. In 1928, 50 years after they first met, the family organized a massive celebration. It was held at the homestead, and people came from all over to honor the couple who had built such a remarkable life together. Samuel gave a moving speech about his parents' example of love and partnership. Caro read from the letter they had written, sharing their story with everyone present. David presented them with a beautiful hand-carved bench, crafted with his own hands, so they could sit together and watch the sunset. Gideon stood to speak, his voice shakier than it once was but still strong. 50 years ago, I was riding through a snowstorm, cold and alone, thinking only about survival. I came across a woman dying by the side of the trail, and I did what any decent person would do. I gave her my blanket. That simple act of kindness changed my entire life. It brought me love, family, purpose, and joy beyond measure." He turned to Chenoa, who sat beside him, her hair now completely white but her eyes still bright and alert. "You came back with an offer I never expected. You offered me yourself, your love, your life. You offered me a chance at happiness I thought was beyond my reach, and I am so grateful I was brave enough to accept. You have been my partner, my best friend, my great love for 5 decades now. You have made every day worth living." Chenoa smiled, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "And you have been mine," she said. "My savior, my husband, my heart. I love you, Gideon Cole. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They kissed to thunderous applause, and Gideon felt such overwhelming happiness that he thought his heart might burst. This was what a life well lived looked like. This was what mattered in the end. Not wealth or fame, but love and connection and the family you built together. As they entered their 80s, both Gideon and Chenoa's health began to decline more noticeably. They needed more help with daily tasks, and Samuel insisted they move into town where he could keep a closer eye on them. They resisted at first, not wanting to leave their homestead, but eventually agreed. The house they had built would stay in the family, cared for by Caro and Joseph, and eventually passed down to their children. Moving to town was difficult, but being closer to Samuel and having easier access to medical care was important. They took a small house with a nice porch, and Samuel or one of the grandchildren visited every day. They still had each other, and that was what mattered most. In the winter of 1932, Chenoa developed pneumonia. Despite Samuel's best efforts, she grew weaker. Gideon never left her side, holding her hand, talking to her, reminding her of all the beautiful moments they had shared. The whole family gathered, knowing the end was near, on a cold February night, 54 years almost to the day after they had first met. Chenoa drew her last breath. Gideon was holding her hand, whispering that he loved her, that he would see her again someday. She smiled at him, squeezed his hand one last time, and then she was gone. The grief was devastating. After 54 years together, Gideon felt like half of himself had been torn away. But he was surrounded by family who loved him, by the legacy they had built together. In his sorrow, he found comfort in knowing that their love had created all of this, had brought so much goodness into the world. He lived for 2 more years, cared for by his children and grandchildren. He spoke often of Chenoa, keeping her memory alive through stories. He told the younger generations about her wisdom and strength, about how she had saved him just as surely as he had saved her. He made sure they understood the depth of what he and Chenoa had shared. On a warm evening in May of 1934, sitting on his porch surrounded by family, Gideon Cole closed his eyes and did not open them again. He was 88 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life. His last thoughts were of Chenoa, of seeing her again, of being whole once more. They buried him beside Chenoa on the hill overlooking the homestead, under a large cottonwood tree. The entire town turned out for the funeral, a testament to the impact he and Chenoa had made on their community. Samuel delivered the eulogy, speaking of his father's courage, compassion, and unwavering love. "My father used to say that one act of kindness can change everything," Samuel said, and he proved it with his life. "When he gave his blanket to my mother, he set in motion a chain of events that created our family, that brought so much love and joy into the world. He taught us to be kind, to be brave, to stand up for what is right. He showed us what true love looks like. We will miss him every day, but we will honor him by living the values he taught us." The legacy of Gideon and Chenoa lived on through their children and grandchildren. Samuel continued his medical practice, treating patients of all backgrounds with equal care and compassion. Caro's school grew and thrived, educating generations of children. David became a respected veterinarian, known throughout the region for his skill and kindness with animals. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing the story of how their grandparents met, of the cowboy who gave his last blanket to a freezing native woman, and the unexpected offer she made in return. It became a family legend, a reminder that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that kindness matters, and that two people committed to each other can overcome any obstacle. The homestead remained in the family for decades, eventually becoming a place where family gathered for reunions and celebrations. The house that Gideon and Chenoa built together stood as a monument to their love, sheltering generation after generation. The old wool blanket, carefully preserved all those years, was passed down through the family as a treasured heirloom. Each generation heard the story of how it had saved Chenoa's life and brought their family into being. It became a symbol of compassion, sacrifice, and the power of love to transform lives. In later years, when great-great-grandchildren asked about Gideon and Chenoa, they were told about two people who had faced a harsh world with courage and built something beautiful together. They were told about a love that transcended boundaries, that grew stronger with each passing year, that created a legacy of kindness and compassion that continued to ripple outward. The story of the cowboy and the native woman he saved became part of the fabric of White River's history, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when people chose love over fear, compassion over prejudice. It reminded people that every person has worth, that every act of kindness matters, and that love, true love, can overcome anything. And so, though Gideon and Chenoa were gone, their love lived on, woven into the lives of everyone they had touched, an enduring testament to the power of a single compassionate act on a cold winter night in 1878. When a lonely cowboy gave his last blanket to a dying woman and received in return the greatest gift of all, a love that would last not just a lifetime, but forever.